the head, the mind, can create a lot of story. And story isn't necessarily based on the ultimate reality of what's happening in front of us. Because we have to remember that it's pulling out from all of this library of all these things that we've experienced in our lives that may or may not be applicable to here and now, but because of some sort of symbol or element that is present here is activating a past memory, we're drawing that book out and saying, oh, it must be related to this.
This is The Deep Dive with Adam Roa. What is up, deep divers? Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive podcast. My guest today is Dr. Meyer. She has been on the podcast before. She is an epic friend, an epic human, and also one of our facilitators in the Create community. And so I call her when I need just like insight into what the hell is happening in my life and what's going on in my world. And so I'm so excited that we basically get to use this podcast as an excuse to do that. So Kat, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for making the second time since the first time the Mexican internet that I'm using just died on me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I mean, if we're turning this into a session for you, then I'm going to send you my invoice by the end.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
No, this is a session. This is a trade. This is a session for both of us. Ideally.
Bring it.
Bring it. Well, I'm going to bring it because, like you said before, I have some difficult rapid fire questions that I'm starting off with. I'm like, let's just jump right into it because you are a doctor, like you're a licensed therapist. And so you get a chance to, you're one of the most educated people I know on a variety of different topics, but specifically around trauma and the somatics of the body and how you combine that with the energetics and esoterics with your study of Tantra and everything. And so I'm really excited for today's theme, which is around attachment and the different attachments in relationships and trauma bonding and all of those things that I know you're so well versed in. And with that, I want to know what is the number one way people can improve their relationships?
The number
hitting you
one.
With a simple rapid fire question.
Is that simple? I don't even know.
What would you recommend if there was like something where everyone listening to this, go work on this one thing in your relationship and you'll see the highest leverage amount of improvement? Yeah.
I would say to learn about, to be connected with the intelligence of your body, because there's so much information that's being spoken to through our body and the constant contractions and expansions of the body. And so we can know when we're in a space of fight or flight response or in a hypo arousal, which is more of like the collapse or the
flight
freeze response.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so when we can tune into where we're at in this space, then we can self-regulate, which is being able to calm our nervous system down to return ourselves to that 0 point or to that calm state. More of this like higher function, this ability to function and clearly communicate and laugh and giggle and all those things. Or co-regulate, which is the allowance of somebody else to comfort us and soothe us and to bring us back to that 0 point. And I think all of our relationships, if we learn the balance of those two, how can I take care of myself here and calm my system as well as let somebody else in, then that can help. I think that solves so many problems.
And it's like so simply said and yet so complicated to do and so difficult to do at times. What is to build on that? What would you say has been the most beneficial way in which you've gotten to feel your body in terms of like being able to feel your responses and develop that kind of nuanced relationship? What are some of the most helpful exercises or practices that you've implemented to do that?
Yeah. So my favorite practice, which is the concept of noticing. So noticing, which I guess is similar to or the same as mindfulness practices, but just really noticing how your body on a moment to moment basis is reacting to your environment or reacting to specific people. Do you get to know those contractions, those expansions, the fluttering of the chest or the sick feeling in your stomach because something is there? And if we give ourselves the spaciousness to be able to inquire and sit in our own energy in our own space and say, okay, what's coming up here? Is it something that is related to this present moment? Well, I guess it is related to the present moment, but is this something that's playing out here? Or is this something that's playing out from a past trauma that's unprocessed, that's being brought forward into the present moment? So noticing mindfulness, meditation, yoga is a form of meditation and mindfulness. Yoga helps us to regulate the nervous system. And if you are paying attention to your body and you're paying attention to the things that are happening inside of you, then it can be highly beneficial. I think for many people who go into yoga, they're not really paying attention to their body as much as they think that they are. They're in their head and making, to-do lists or thinking about the hot girl that's next to them or, whatever it is. So I think those pieces are the most powerful, I would say.
Yeah. And something that I'll to build on that, I would say that even for myself, what I learned ultimately was to pay attention to just the physical sensations in the body and before assigning meaning to them. Like I was always searching kind of mentally for like, what's happening, what's going on, trying to understand. And I almost had to separate the two and say, actually, right now, I'm not doing any of that. And I'm just going to pay attention to what am I physically sensing? It's like, wow, my heart feels like it's racing. My throat feels really constricted. Okay. I feel like really like upset in my stomach or something. And just notice the physical sensations and then just pay attention to that first and foremost, because the part of me that wanted to try and decipher what those meant was almost getting in the way of my ability to catch the little sensations. And for me, I've gotten more and more able to capture the nuanced sensations when I allow myself to just pay attention to them for the sensation itself and not for the meaning.
Right. And so oftentimes when we try to process, we go straight to the brain, because that's just how we tend to operate here. And it's easier to access the brain. We spend so much time in our heads, given everything that we're trying to produce or be on the computer or, given technology that have given us the opportunity to do all those things. And it's a lot slower of a process to both self-regulate and to move through emotion if we go through the brain, because the head, the mind, can create a lot of story. And story isn't necessarily based on the ultimate reality of what's happening in front of us, because we have to remember that it's pulling out from all of this library of all these things that we've experienced in our lives that may or may not be applicable to here and now, but because of some sort of symbol or element that is present here is activating a past memory, we're drawing that book out and saying, oh, it must be related to this. But the body, the moment, if we stop and we go into the body first and we feel here, then we have so much more. The process of regulation and the process of processing is so much faster than the otherwise. Because, let me draw this model for you. So we are constantly operating on this system of like this window of tolerance. And we have a line above, which is if we go above that window of tolerance or that threshold of what we can tolerate emotionally, then we become hyper aroused. And that's fight or flight response. And that's where we might scream, we might yell, we might try to make somebody jealous. We feel all the buzziness in the body. We feel like a clench in the stomach, racing of the heart, any of those kinds of things. Below that window of tolerance, the threshold is hypoaroused, and that's your collapse or freeze response. And so that's where we might disassociate, we might disconnect, we might get quiet, we might shut down. And within that window we're operating really well. So we can think really clearly. We can plan. We can laugh. We can talk with other people. It's great. Like this is our best functioning. And where was I going with this? The more that we can connect with the subtle nuances, like you were saying, and like catch those sensations as they are approaching the threshold, or once we've gone past that threshold, then we can say, okay, I'm out of my window of tolerance. So what do I need to do to bring myself back? And we can best process when we're in the window of tolerance. If you are contemplating things, like say you went through a breakup and you go back into the relationship and you're trying to pull out what happened to the relationship. If you're in a fight or flight response, if you're hyper aroused and you try to go back there and look into the relationship, you end up ruminating. You go in circles, circles, circles. The brain's like trying to make up the reason of this, but you don't ever actually find resolution. And in fact, by the end of that thought process, you're just exhausted. But if you are in the window of tolerance, meaning that higher state of functioning, then you go back into the relationship and try to look through it. This is contemplation, because you're not looking at it from a state of fight or flight response, and you can look at it more objectively.
How does someone come in at the under? Like, how do you come in under that threshold and wind up in hypo, in that freeze response? Like, how do you come back into the window of tolerance? No, like, so I could understand how something could push me over the threshold into hyper, right? Mm-hmm. But how does something come in under and with hypo? So ultimately, like if we think about both the above and the below thresholds, it's still hitting your threshold of what you can tolerate. Some people have a tendency to do more hyper, and then some have a tendency to do more hypo. So for me, growing up, it was more of I would faint, I would pass out, I would go into depression. I would shut down. My brain would get foggy. I would disassociate. I would, just not, no energy. It would just kind of like leave. And then for somebody who would go into the hyper arousal, and we all have elements of all of these, would be somebody who is like a surge of energy that courses through their body. So if we think about survival strategies, when we're in the sympathetic nervous system, which again is including all of these things: fight, flight, freeze, collapse. They're just different manifestations of our way to survive. Okay. Amazing. So, wow. So on to the next non-rapid fire question.
No, I told you. I don't know that I can do
great.
rapid.
This is awesome. We're going deep. I'm going to not call them rapid fire. I'm going to call them just deep dive questions. Or deep
there you
dive
go.
Questions, right?
Yeah.
So as you've and it's perfect, because like you said, everyone's got their thresholds and what kind of pushes people in. We can all respond differently, but there's definitely patterns. And I'd be curious, as a therapist who sees clients regularly, and as an influencer online who leads retreats and all these things, I would love to hear from you what you seem to have found as being the most common issue that people seem to face. Like what is the thing that right now you're seeing most people seem to be struggling with?
I think beneath many of the things that we struggle with, we can find some of these unmet childhood needs, or these, unresolved, well, not necessarily unresolved, but these elements or these experiences that we had when we were children that we translate through our child's brain as oftentimes meaning something about us, because the brain has, we perceive at that age, we have more of like an egocentric type of mind. So everything filters through what I do, as if we have responsibility or control or power more than, or the effect more than what we actually do, right? Because it's more of a balance of us and the environment. So as kids, we see these things happen, and then we put them through the lens of what did I do, or how can I prevent this in the future? It's a survival mechanism. However, it's not necessarily based in reality. And if we don't resolve those, or say those needs are still not met, then we oftentimes carry them through into our adult relationships, and we project them unconsciously or unconsciously to those people around us. And again, this comes back to the nervous system. Like, our nervous system is designed within the first 2 years of our life, depending on what's going on in the environment, depending on if we perceive our needs being met, and depending on how responsive our parents were to us or our primary caregivers were to us, will all help to design how our nervous system responds most to help us survive.
Yeah, which is actually such a perfect segue into what I primarily wanted to talk to you about today, which is attachment and attachment theory. This is inspired by, with these podcasts, I'm really wanting to center the topics around the themes that are showing up in my music that I'm releasing. And you got an early listen on the song that came out, Go, where literally the chorus is, baby, will you come back home? I'm trying. And baby, will you come back home? I'm dying. Every time you call my name, I'm there. And I was going through a period where my attachment that I saw mirrored in my fear of being alone and all the things that I began to uncover, I feel like is in the lyrics of the song. And what's funny about that is that so many songs have that sort of "you're my everything, come back" attachment aspect to it. And I think that they model, I went back and forth on this because it's the truth of how I felt. And yet I don't want to, the importance of this podcast for me is to really talk about, I'm aware that these lyrics contain this, and I want all of you who are hearing this to understand some of those layers so that you don't just be like, oh, how romantic, baby, come back home, I'm dead. Also understand the layers of what was going on in my psychology there. And so if you wouldn't mind, I'd love if you could speak to what is attachment theory and a bit of a baseline for people to understand as we're going to go into that now.
Yeah. So attachment theory is based on the relationships that we first form with our primary caregivers, whether that be our parents or otherwise. And it is how well they were able to meet our needs, how well they were able to attune, which means read our facial expressions, our body language, our cries, to be able to meet what it is that we needed or wanted. And we can look at those basic core needs, those core basic needs, into a few different A's. So affection, appreciation, allowing, acceptance, and availability and attention. So if those emotional needs aren't met, or if our physical needs aren't met, or safety isn't met, then it activates it creates the development of the nervous system in a way that would most benefit us. So kind of like what we were talking about earlier, hyper arousal. Like if we perceive that we're not going to be safe or we're not going to get our needs met, then it would be advantageous for our body to kick into fight or flight mode in order to get those needs met, in order to keep us safe. Or for some of us, if we perceive that if our needs aren't important, or if our parents turn away, or even just turn their faces away when we're reaching out to them, then it gets stored in our nervous system that it may not be safe to be expressive. And so we might do more hypoarousal or shutting down, as if to quell the attachment need, or make it so that turn it off so that we don't actually need somebody else. So from that, within the first 2 years, this just builds our foundation. Now, of course, we have a whole lifetime through our development into the teens, into the adults, of all these other relationships and experiences that we have that help to formulate and change the attachment. We also have with specific people, we might have a different alchemy with one person than we do with another. And so it's quite complex. Unfortunately, there's a lot of conversation about it, which is amazing. And the conversations that I'm seeing repeatedly had are pop psychology versions of this. And I have heard multiple couples where one will come to me and say, my girlfriend says that I'm avoidant, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, you're more than likely not avoidant because I know you, but because they read a book or because they read an article, they oftentimes will just use one of the 4 categories, and I'll get into that, and label somebody as this, like this is your personality, instead of understanding that this is such a complex theory that there are actually 19 different subcategories, and we often change, and we often have elements of every single one of them. So to call one person one thing or another is not acknowledging the uniqueness of an individual, and can also create more shame type of conversation. So what you'll often hear in conversation is these 4 categories of secure, which means that your relationship needs were met. You have a strong sense of trust, like an epistemic trust with other people, that your needs will get met, that they're telling the truth, that you can rely on them. Anxious, which, how do I want to say this? So let me describe this a little bit differently. This might be easier. So if we draw a quadrant with one line going straight up and down vertically and another line that's going horizontal in the middle of that one,
like a plus sign.
Like a plus sign. One of those is a spectrum of avoidance. And avoidance is whether it's the inability to connect with our emotions as they are live on the surface of our body, or maybe it's that we have a difficult time with communicating things that we need, or even know that we have needs. This is oftentimes the feeling that intimacy or growing intimacy is dangerous, that it's actually a threat. And the further you are on that spectrum, a lot of times what we'll see is people will feel like, if the person, and this has to do with intimacy, building intimacy, if the person actually knows who I am, then they won't want to be with me. So the more that you are on that avoidance spectrum, I would look at the underlying belief that you may be holding there as a sense to protect yourself. And then on the other axis is anxious. So the more anxiety that you get in a relationship or regarding a relationship, and those can manifest as actions that would drive you to gain greater closeness with the other person. So there's a fear of abandonment. There's a fear of losing that attachment with this particular person. So sometimes they'll do what we call protest behaviors. And those are things like trying to make the other person jealous, or incessantly calling the phone, or obsessively thinking about the other person, or worried about the status of the relationship. Sometimes difficulty with authenticity and abandoning yourself or self-sacrificing yourself for the sake of holding this relationship. So all of us fall somewhere along that spectrum. And if you may be high in anxiety and low on avoidance, and then we would categorize you primarily around the anxious aspect of it. And if you are low on anxiety or high on avoidance, then we may say that you have more of avoidant tendencies. Secure is secure is the category where somebody has less of either of those things. And then somebody who's high in both of them, we often say that they have more fearful avoidant tendencies. So, and again, we all we can dart around on this chart. I can't even talk today. Thank God I love myself. But we can move around on that. And also as we grow, and if this is something that we are intentionally working on, then we can evolve out of that, or we can become more secure, or we can still have anxiety, but act secure. So we can still create secure relationships, no matter where you're at on the chart. So ultimately, I like to say, knowing these things about you isn't necessarily saying that you are this personality. It's more, and it's not even like we measure you by the behaviors that manifest. because I can be avoidant, have more avoidant tendencies, but still have some anxious behaviors and some secure behaviors.
What is up, deep divers? Pardon the interruption. I just wanted to take a moment to let you know about the Create community. It is the collective renaissance of education, art, transformation, and entertainment. And we are having live online events every single week. And this is where I actually teach my energetic wizardry class every week alongside some of the most epic personal development facilitators that I personally know. And if you have been looking for the place where you can go, like a modern mystery school, like where you can go and learn about things like business and astrology and gene keys and the energetics of how to create your reality, this is the place for you. This is a growing community. We would love to have you visit thecreatecommunity.com to join. And then the fourth is it disorganized? What is it?
Yeah, disorganized, also called fearful avoidant, also called ambivalent.
That's the one. So what I loved was someone gave me the book Attached. And I think that's the book you referred to earlier, where you're like, okay, that's a bit of that pop psychology. Like, let's make this really accessible, but it makes it something where people want to categorize very easily. And I spoke to that actually in one of my musing podcasts where I break down these 4 categories. And I'm like, these are like really simply done. And yet, there's so many combinations of these. Like you said, there's like 19 different categorizations. And so what's interesting is, like, in myself, what I found was, okay, I don't know what it's been, but I know that I've had a lot of avoidant. I've had a lot of avoidant in my past around, okay, the grass is always greener. Like, let me find all the faults in my partner. Let me pay attention to all the little things that are showing that it's not right, so I don't get too attached. Whereas, because I'm afraid someone's going to leave or whatever that might be. Sure. And then at the same time, that anxiousness of wanting to make someone jealous and like bring them so that they get more attached to me vibe because of the anxiety. And I was just going, why? I feel like I'm all of these things to some extent. And is it because, so when we talk about our early childhood and very, very early on, I think about just my father and my mother having had codependent tendencies and really wanting to attach. And my father being such this stereotypical stoic Asian man who never showed emotion. I'm like, wow, I got both, right? Like, I really did get this, this person's unavailable for my needs. And then this person's like really on top of me for my needs. And would you say that, because when I read these articles and stuff, I hear that like 50% of the population secure is what I heard. Is that accurate? I feel like that's so high.
That is actually very accurate. It only takes 30% of a parent attuning to their child properly, like actually meeting the needs that's meaningful for the child in order for them to be secure. Now, secure does not mean that you're absent of avoidant behavior or anxious behavior. They still can. However, what we would look at if we were to give you an assessment, then we may see that you are secure because you got your needs met and you felt safe. You felt that your parents were able to attune to you 30% of the time. And you picked up behaviors of how to love from your parent, from observing your parents. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you are avoidant or that you are anxious. It just is you're secure with these tendencies. And that's where the complexity of this happens. And that's where the shaming happens too. Because what I hear so often from people, and it's like on Instagram, my feed will be filled with, because I follow a lot of psychologists, and they try to, break down the attachment theory. And I will read in the comments, and people are like, yeah, I am anxious and avoidant. And in my head, I'm like, no, you aren't, baby. You're just reading what these are and you're applying it to yourself. But to be fearfully avoidant, which is the combination, which is being both high in anxiety and avoidance, would be somebody who experienced a trauma during an early age and nobody was able to meet them and help them regulate in the way that they needed.
So would that be me? As someone who's experienced sexual abuse at the age of 5 and it was repressed, which is interesting to me. And that was a question I had as well. It's like, when it comes to something like a repressed trauma,
yeah,
and how that comes in, is the repression the result of the conscious mind going, we don't know how to handle this, or we feel like this would blow a circuit, this would blow a fuse, so we need to like block this out until the time comes where we feel safe enough to that we can process it? Is that essentially what's happening?
You gave me 2 different questions. So the first one, you asked if that would mean that you were anxious, avoidant. And my answer to that would be no. Knowing you as well as I do, because somebody who's disorganized attachment or fearful avoidant is somebody who experienced that trauma, oftentimes will use the strategy of disassociation as a self-regulator. They typically have a very difficult time with feeling grounded or being able, there's a almost sense of purposelessness in their lives. They have a difficult time with exploring in the world unless they have somebody with them. And even then, if they have somebody with them, they're more focused on this drama between keeping the person or not keeping the person than they would go out into the world and explore who they are in the world. Like that is not as much of an importance as it is to, this drama that's happening here. I oftentimes will, and also what's characteristic of somebody with disorganized attachment is they will produce a lot of things for the sake of producing and never share it with the world. So somebody with that attachment, which is also the rarest of all of them. Oftentimes they'll have parents who, maybe a parent was schizophrenic, or a parent had drug abuse issues, or things like that would be really traumatic and cause the child to freeze a lot because the child wouldn't know which way to go. If the parent is narcissistic and has psychotic issues or that kind of thing, the child would be like frozen all the time. Like, do I tiptoe down the hallway to, go get a cookie in the cookie jar, or is my parent going to come out raging? And so that would cause somebody to have this more of this type of attachment moving forward.
Got it. Okay. And so for everyone listening to this, even for myself, we are such nuanced creatures, and there's so many different aspects where in one moment you can feel this and this and then this. And so I think what I'm taking away from this and hope that others are taking away from it is to also not be so quick to label. Yeah. Right. Not be so quick to label and say, this is what I am. It's similarly with the 5 love languages. I think the 5 love languages are great as like some information, but it's very important to recognize like we all have all of them to some degree. And there's probably more than 5 in various nuances in a lot of different ways. And if we just label and say, oh, I'm avoidant, or I'm anxious, or I'm both of those things because I have categories, it can be limiting, and it can also be frustrating. Do you feel like, can you speak to how people could shift? Because once they've identified, oh, I have these aspects, and without labeling it, I just see these things. What are ways in which people can begin to work on those? Yeah. And different protocol for everybody who's presenting with this, because everybody has, if they're higher on the anxiety, things like self-regulation, and so that they don't keep turning to somebody else to co-regulate for them. So learning that, I would say meditations, yoga, breath work, working with a somatic therapist, that kind of thing. Learning about your, I would say Vipassana meditation is really good to connect you with your emotions and with your feeling body, because our emotions live on the surface of our body, meaning like they're right there as in each of these moments as we're moving through. And the more that we can be connected with the nuances, then we can more easily connect with, okay, what's true for me? What is it that I need? Because
that can be a short-circuiting question, especially if you grew up where having needs was a threat to losing the person that you attached to. So teaching yourself, oh, I do have needs. Everybody has needs. It's okay to have needs. What are those needs? As you tune in and you practice giving yourself that space and asking that question, and feeling that, visceral reaction in the body, and then learning how to vulnerably communicate that. Teaching yourself to wear your heart on your sleeve more. And from that particular experience, the more that we can speak to what's authentic to us, what is alive, what's congruent, what I'm feeling is how I'm acting is what I'm speaking, then we develop more of a trustful relationship, and we can develop more of a secure relationship. And from those evidence that we gain more and more and more, that can help to reprogram in our mind that it's not safe to be vulnerable, to speak our truth, to relax in a situation, to feel safe in a situation, to be ourselves. So,
yeah, I would say that, and that ties into the second part of the question that I want to make sure to answer in case anyone's out there like, wait, you didn't answer that second part, around the repressed memory, because I was just having a conversation earlier today around the repressed memory, and my understanding from the research that I've done around it, as I've tried to understand how that even happened for myself, what's going on, is essentially the metaphor was just like, imagine just like a breaker switch in your home, and just being like, well, too much voltage, shut it off. And at a later point, when the system goes, okay, we're now capable of handling this much voltage, that memory can start to come back in. And that might look like, and often looks like, when people start doing work on themselves in a lot of ways, because they develop self-regulation tools and techniques, and so that equips them better, or they start to develop friendships and people where they feel safe with those people, and so maybe that's what's coming up. But the unconscious has now gone, okay, we have enough pieces in place where this can start to come back. And I just kind of wanted you to speak to that, because I think, because when you said something like a disorganized attachment style with someone who's experienced something early in life that's so traumatic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have that, you're going to be disorganized attachment style. I just wanted you to that's where that question came from. And I'm curious if you wanted to speak to that at all for anyone who may have that.
Yeah. And I can even use my own experience. I had something that happened early on that I had the memory throughout my childhood and teens, but it was never like in the forefront of my mind. It was always like percolating in the back, until I had a client who was a perpetrator, and hearing his story after session activated all the floods of the visceral feelings and the images and everything coming back. And so, yes, the brain has an amazing ability of disassociation, or being able to, hide, quote unquote, hide that memory in our limbic system, so that we don't have it, we don't access it. But what's interesting when we go through trauma is that the brain inputs all the pieces of the memory in pieces. So all the data is in pieces. So we might experience like a startle response, or we might experience nightmares or flashbacks, or, crawling out of our skin, or, all these other symptoms that aren't the full experience there. And those are signs that the brain is trying to process through something that got stuck in the past. And when we experience something like, I guess any of those symptoms, then that's when there's something in our environment, or something in our mind, or something that is related to that memory, that experience, that it is activating and pulling up that file in that exact moment. And again, it may just be pulling parts of that memory in that moment instead of the whole thing. So I do EMDR work, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a more of a rapid processing experience to help your brain to be able to take all the data pieces and process it together so it can move through the brain and move through the body. I bring in a lot of somatic there too, so that by the end of a session, it neutralizes that memory and your brain isn't keep getting stuck on that.
Yeah, that's, for me, it was a similar thing. It's like I always had so the night of my abuse, I always had the first part of the night as a memory, like significantly, like to the point where I remembered like the fact that random uneventful memory was just always present for me for my entire life was it's now I see why, but I don't remember much of my childhood. Like I don't have a ton of childhood memories that I don't go back in. I'm like, oh, I remember that and that and that. And yet this one memory stood out. And then the rest of the night came back. Right. And so it's interesting how the brain can do that and leave little breadcrumbs and little, like the evidence is always there. And I think that for me, one of the most fascinating aspects has been because it was repressed until I was about 30, 31, and I was deep in my personal development and spiritual journey at that point. And I felt like I was able to reverse engineer my life and the ways in which it had impacted me from like an eagle eye view a little bit, as opposed to like just growing up with that awareness. And I feel like one of the most difficult things for me has been seeing the ways in which it's still impacting my experience. And it's tough for me to describe it, but people may relate to this. Is just like when I can feel the texture of the same energetic, where it's like, ooh, this is that same feel as this abuse and other areas of my life. And feeling like, I don't know, feeling the frustration of like, wow, this is impacting even my current relationship. This is impacting my current relationship, and I'm not even sure what to do in this moment. And it feels like there are so many people who have that same thing, where it's like they know whatever attachment style they have or whatever trauma in their past or wounding, they're sitting here listening to this conversation and going, it's still impacting my relationship or my relationships or my life in general. And I just don't even know what to do. I don't know what to do. And you and I are both people who have done a lot around it. And work, and even maybe a few days ago, we were talking about like, how much longer does this go? How far do we go in just saying, I'm just keep unraveling it and unraveling it, unraveling it. Is there a point in psychology, like I'd be curious in psychology and what you've learned in all of your study, is there such a thing as like a point in which it's no longer impacting, like it's no longer affecting our relationships anymore?
Yeah. And there's many different theories on that exact question. Like I dove in after our conversation and was like, what is, and it's really tricky to measure that. Because, and in the research around EMDR, it's one of the number one most researched trauma-oriented type of therapy. And then combine that with somatic, then you have a new layer of, helping to alleviate it out of the body and the body's memory. And then you also have many practitioners and theorists around, even before those pieces, you've got to talk to the parts of the body. So IFS is intra-family systems type of therapy. I know I'm bringing a lot of words, but this is about integrating all the parts that were alive during that time. So the childhood parts that are still unprocessed or unmet needs, because even those can get in the way of the work of the somatics or of the EMDR. So there's many theories around, different things that you can do or different parts that might be getting in the way of the work actually happening. And then there's the question of how are we defining healed? Are we defining healed as somebody who has an absence of any of these effects on their nervous system and they just, flow through life pretty easy breezy? Or we can define heal, which can create a lot of shame and a lot of like addiction to the healing arts, and like, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next workshop? What's the next, healing modality or drug or psychedelic or whatever? Or you can also identify or define healing as the reduction of intensity, frequency, and duration. And when we look at those, then can we find acceptance in the fact that we are human having a human experience, and there is nothing wrong and nothing to change, but to learn what our particular human vulnerabilities are, learn the particular human vulnerabilities of our partner, and so that we can both meet each other in a place that's meaningful when these things happen. So the healing happens more experientially as we flow through life, instead of looking for a specific thing to be the thing. Because again, a secure relationship can help us to become more secure. It just takes a while because we're building up the evidence to suggest that it is safe for me to feel exactly as I am. Again, the core basic human needs, 2 of them are allowance and acceptance. If we are allowed to be in the exact human experience that we are in by our partner, and then they accept us in whatever human experience that we are in, that is very healing, and it causes us to feel satiated, like we're met. We're allowed.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things that I believe and is so necessary, is that it has to involve conversation, safe, compassionate conversation, because being willing to speak about what you're feeling, saying, I'm feeling anxious right now around this, is validating what you're feeling. It's saying, I'm feeling this and it's worthy of being spoken about. It's worthy of me acknowledging. It's worthy of me saying, like, I'm not going to pretend this isn't happening. And then on the other side of that is where you're expressing that and how you're expressing that. Is it in a safe container where you are going to be accepted and it's going to be allowed, and you're going to be able to reprogram maybe those early unmet childhood needs and realize, wow, when I say this, my partner still loves me, or my therapist doesn't judge me, or my coach says good job for being honest and open. Like, that reprogramming is going to allow the system to ststart to relax and feel like, oh, I can be me. And that I can be me relaxation, we talked about it from an aspect of like a repressed memory, finally having the safe space but any of it, emotion, the depth of emotion that we all carry, being finally allowed to come up and out. And I'm so grateful to have friends like you, where like you're one of those spaces for me. You literally are one of those spaces where I can call you up and talk to you and say, this is what I'm feeling. I'm having this. And I think right before we started this, I was telling you how my girlfriend left like 5 hours ago, and I'm going through this process of discomfort in my system, which is interesting. And in my mind, I didn't think I would go through, but here I am going through that 5 hours into it and going, okay, I'll adjust, but it's good for me to notice. It's a very powerful aspect of that. And so I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for being that, and being one of those positive, safe spaces for me in my life.
Yeah. And I just want to acknowledge that expression of what you just experienced is a great model for other people to view. Of you have a healthy experience of self-regulation and co-regulation. So this parting with her and that feeling that you're having, that missing, is one that suggests that, oh, you have allowed her to be a co-regulator with her. And now that source is gone. And look how you're still able to regulate yourself and do what you need to do to calm your own nervous system down. So it's not the absence of the void feeling, like, I miss that, like there's an empty feeling. That's not, doesn't have to do with not being secure. That actually, what I'm viewing is this is a secure relationship, and you have a good relationship with yourself here. So
beautiful.
that other. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And a reminder to everyone that like, we're like, if you're trying to get to a place where you never feel those uncomfortable feelings, you will never arrive at that place. Like that's not the human experience. But when you get to a place where you realize you have the ability to regulate your own nervous system, when you have gotten to a place where you know what works for you to feel more love inside yourself, for life, and you've gotten to that place and you've done that work, you're equipped. And ultimately, it'll still come down to choice. Like I chose to take a nap, and then I woke up and I spent like 45 minutes on the internet and I was like going through social media, and I felt myself get to that place where I was like, this is now me avoiding. Like I'm now actually avoiding, and I knew I was in it. And then it was just like still going into it. And then I closed the app and I was like, I'm going to open a different app now. And it's just like, then I give myself the excuse, the election just let me just like see what's going on. And I just allowed myself to defend the fact that I was avoiding. And, but I'm aware of it. And at the end of the day, it'll always come down to choice. And that's what I hope that everyone who's been listening to this, you leave this with, is that you have choice. You have choice. You have the ability to choose how you respond to the discomfort that comes up. You have the ability to choose how you respond to the moments when you feel that anxious attachment or that avoidant attachment, those things popping their heads up. And I hope that that you continue to choose the path of love in whatever form that is for you and the way that it supports you best, and loving others and loving yourself. So, Dr. Kat Meyer, it's been such a pleasure. Would you please let people know like how they can follow you? You have your own, you have 2 amazing podcasts and all the places. Why don't you just like let people know where they can get more of you? Cause I want more, and I'm sure a lot of people do.
Yeah. So they can find me on Instagram at Sex Love Yoga. That's also my website, sexloveyoga.com, or my podcasts are Eat, Play, Sex, which is all these epic interviews with experts on sex, love, and yoga, or sex, love, and nutrition. And then my second podcast is Erotically Wasted, which is 5 minutes of just erotic pleasure straight to your ears. No big deal.
There you go. And for those of you who want to learn directly from Dr. Kat Meyer, she is in the Create community, thecreatecommunity.com. She teaches in-body sexploration multiple times a month. And like you're all over the place, and you have so much wisdom, and I'm so grateful for your time and doing this a second time since the first one got cut off. Appreciate you. And to all the deep divers that have been listening to this, if you've gotten value out of this podcast, please leave a review and subscribe, follow, all of those things to help the podcast spread, because it really makes a difference. And I want to remind you that always, in all ways, you are seen, you are heard, and you are loved. I hope all of you have a beautiful rest of your day.